Good morning and welcome to this week's Jump recruitment discussion. This week we're discussing burn it down, build it bigger, rethinking growth by breaking your own model. I think it's a really interesting conversation. This is the last one that we're going to do on growth. And then next week, we've got our last Recruitment Leaders Unlocked podcast coming out on growth. And then we're going to start on a new series on leadership. So it's going to be a really interesting discussion today. Today, I'm joined by Mr. Jacobs. Good to see you, Paul.
Nice to see you, Howard.
Yes, we can see you. And the lovely Heather Thorways with us today. Hello, Heather. So I'm sure we're going to get some very interesting questions, hopefully polarize each other in various different ways to see what's going on. So I'm going to kick off with question one. Okay. We often talk about on our podcasts and webinars about firing the bottom 20% of clients. How do you identify which clients need to go and when?
Oh, tough questions this week, Heather. I mean, I'm not, I don't like the word firing particularly. I think it's kind of a pretty.
Oh, you could never work in
tough.
HR then. I love it.
Well, I know you HR people thrive on firing people, but I don't like the phrase particularly. I think that it's no business wants to remove itself from a client, and this is part of the issue. That what we tend to do is persist with organizations when everything is screaming at us to let it go, move on, find other better business. There's always this sense that things could improve. We might just get the placement we've always been driving for. We might just get temp business or whatever. I think there are various reasons why you get to a point where it isn't going to work, and several of I think the indicators are that they have limited or no respect for the suppliers that they work with. That's pretty obvious if you are one of those suppliers. All the signs are there. They don't take the calls, they don't answer the emails you send, they don't respond to the CVs you send, they won't meet you no matter how many times you ask. They're dismissive, they take forever to interview people, and then even further period of time before they give you answers. They're very dismissive, and you just feel that they are simply not interested in cultivating any kind of relationship. By the way, it won't just be you, it will be everybody else that supplies them. And you'll also get further proof of that through the candidates that you meet and talk to who work for the business, because my opinion has always been that if they treat their own people badly, they will certainly treat suppliers that way. So the other things, of course, relate to finance. Are they paying on time? Are there issues around dodgy credits, backdoor placements? We could go on and on. You get to a point, frankly, where it is blindingly obvious that you are not going to be doing business with this organization. They are sapping time and energy from you and your colleagues. And there comes a stage where collectively, and I'll emphasize this phrase, collectively, it should never be one individual's conversation or decision. You make the decision that it's time to drop the client and look for better business elsewhere. But I would say that's not a sudden decision. It should be something that you've been thinking about and looking at and analyzing over a lengthy period of time. So I'm not sure I like the word fire. I think it's much more an analytical situation where over a period of time you're dissecting information, looking very carefully at what's going on, also looking at the sectors they're involved in, if they're thriving or they're declining, and making those kind of conscious, collective, constructive decisions within the business.
Well, there's a political answer. Now let's have a HR answer.
Oh, fire and get rid of it.
Actually, I think it's the other way around. That was a nice fluffy HR answer, Paul. It's not like you at all.
No, it isn't. Maybe I'm just feeling good today.
For me, there's two pieces of data that you need to collect. You need some information on how much time you spend. You're going to get that from your consultants, right? How much time do you spend on each of your clients? And then you need to speak to whoever provides your finance. So if you've got a finance director, great. If not, who's providing your accounting services, and get some data about how much money you're making out of clients, and then just compare the two, right? So if you've got people you're spending loads of time on and you're not making any money,
move on.
Right, move on. And when do you do it? Now. Right,
yes.
Stop mucking about, wasting time. Well, I've been having this conversation with a client this week, right, who is is just spending so much time on unproductive clients,
Yeah.
on placements that are potential high earners, but they're never going to fill them.
Yeah.
Right? They're just never going to fill them. So for me, it's actually, that's the really not fluffy HR answer for you. Collect some data about how much time you're spending, how much money you're making, compare the two, make some decisions and get on with it.
I'm surprised you didn't put them on a performance review. And
Well,
then
it's like a performance review, but there's no warnings for this. There's no
So-
warnings. There's no progression. It's just get on with it.
Yeah.
You're done, dead in the water.
So, Paul, whilst I answer this question, Paul, can you mute yourself and then call Heather and find out where the real Heather actually is?
Yeah, no, there's an alien that's just turned up.
So I'm going to go with. I like the word fire because I think we should be doing, and I think we've got to think about that 20%. And I don't think it actually means 20% by turnover. I think what you two said of all is right. Think about your placement ratios, your time to fill. Think about the profit you've made after all the appropriate costs have been removed. And that includes your consultant cost, the time they spend, the number of CVs that you've procured to get in there, etc. Payment days, all of those things start to identify whether it's a bad client or not. And I think the conversation about when is always a bit of a tricky conversation, because obviously we're going to sort of move on to this or that, but I think there has to be a tipping point of when you fire them. So I think firing's not an option. I think we do get rid of them, but it's a point of, do we go back and try to re-educate the worst clients before we start to replace them? And therefore you need a strategy to go from one, get rid, to have other clients where you're bringing clients in to replace the revenue, and therefore there's a tipping point to be had. And I think clients, I think managers, recruiters, etc., often hang on to clients because they're a big name. They generate high revenue, but in reality, when it comes down to it, you actually make very little money from those clients, and they need to think about redistributing your consultants' time and allocate that time to finding better clients to actually service. So whether that's a perm position or a contract position, temp resource, or allocate that person into a resource position, you'll generate more gross profit from that person. I think that's at the end of the day what you got to think about is the person that's actually working on that client, are you generating gross profit? And when you look at the net profit, is it a reasonable amount? And if it's not, then we've got to think about there. And I think it's all about vanity over sanity in some of this market. And in this market,
Like that, vanity over sanity.
it is
Nice.
the vanity. I'm going to hang on to this client because it's a great client, and it's vanity over science. But I think in this market,
That's definitely true. I've definitely seen that, Howard, with big names. I won't name them, but big names that you get really excited that you're a supplier to this big name.
Yep.
And actually, because they're such a big name and they've got all the power in the relationship, they treat you appallingly and they get away with it because of who they are.
That's right.
So I think that vanity over sanity is a great way of describing it.
Absolutely.
I had a client that was generating, and they loved the word turnover, £6 million from a client. And when we worked out their gross profit, it was less than 50K. They had 3 people working on the client, and they hadn't even think about taking out the cost of running the client. And when they actually run the client, they were making a loss.
Yeah.
Yeah, they would be.
And yet they refused point blank to fire the client.
Yeah.
That one needed firing immediately. So let's move on. Let's move on. And let's try and let's keep Heather on the feisty front, and let's see what's going on.
That's not difficult.
Okay, so the question then is, what's the biggest sign that your recruitment business model is outdated, and how do leaders often miss this?
I've recently was working abroad doing some coaching, and we were making reference to that, the very famous Stephen Covey book, Effective Behaviors and so forth, 7 Effective Behaviors and so forth. I can never remember the exact title, but you know what I mean.
7 Habits.
That's it. You got it. I can't remember.
Highly effective people.
That's the one. Thank you. And one of the things, and it's not just that book, it's a fairly standard conversation, is that you should be trying to get yourself into a position as a leader where 70% of your time is spent looking outwards, rather than the opposite, which most leaders find themselves in a position of dealing with, which is 70% of their time dealing with internal issues. So it's about making sure that you're aware of what's going on in your market. And that, I think, comes down to speaking to clients regularly, seeing them regularly, being aware of market trends, being able to see what literally is coming around the corner, making sure that you're attending seminars, conferences, that you're up to date with whatever trends and metrics are coming out of your particular areas of interest. And if the leaders do not do this, it's pretty unlikely that anyone else is going to be doing it within the business. And I think too often, because we get immersed inside our own cocoons and our own businesses, we're so busy dealing with the internal minutiae, we don't get the opportunity to really scan what's occurring. If we did, we'd be aware that certain elements of what we do is becoming outdated, that we're not aware of our clients' sentiments, we're not aware of market trends, and potentially what is likely to be hitting us pretty hard in the not too distant future. And I think when that happens, it's not difficult at all to find that very quickly the model that you've been utilizing, often for many, many years, that has served you well, is becoming outdated, it's becoming old-fashioned. It's not something clients are looking for going forward. And then suddenly it hits you because revenue takes a big drop. And then it becomes, and we'll come to this point, a panic as to what other sectors or what other customers we can start working with. For me, this comes down to something very important. You've got to be in a position as a leader to be proactive, to be strategic in your thinking, to try to become aware of what's occurring and is likely to occur to your business before it happens, and be working at transitioning your business over a period of time to take advantage of new opportunities, new business ventures and new organizations that are going to help your business develop. If you stay in one place and you're rigid, a bit like that skyscraper, if you're not flexible, you remain rigid, ultimately it's going to tumble. Your business is going to fail. And I think if you look at the greatest business models in the world, they're businesses that are they pivot quite quickly. They're constantly evolving, constantly changing, new products, new methodologies, even when they're hugely successful. And I think our industry, I'm afraid, is littered with businesses who have done the same things over and over and over and over and over and over again over years. And for the most part, it served them well. But there's a refusal, if you like, to change methodology or invest in technology, for example, that will help them free up time for their people to do other things. And it's that rigidity and that lack of knowledge or that expansive view of what's going on that causes businesses to become outmoded, outdated, and not regarded particularly well by customers. So it's about the leaders looking outwards and consistently looking at what's coming in their direction and being on the front foot, moving their businesses in an agile fashion so that they're not caught short, they're not caught in a position where suddenly the business is deteriorating and it becomes too late to save it.
Mm. There's some really interesting stuff I think that you can look at in a business to do with data as well. It's another one where you're talking to your finance director, you're talking to your finance providers. You can see it in margins being squeezed, which we've seen over time, haven't we, with those industries that have, for example, nursing and social care, and you see margins being squeezed, but you're still trying to deliver the same delivery model with declining margins, right? So you can definitely see signs of this in your accounts, in your finances, tailing off around profitability in particular delivery models. But it's also, I think, linked to what you're saying, Paul. The slightly fluffier thing is if your strategy is a document that sits in a drawer, right, you're likely to be operating in an out-of-date model. So if your strategy is something that you did it once when you set your business up and you never looked at it again, right, as opposed to a living document that you're constantly seeking external validation of, external input, that you're looking at what's going on in the market, you're looking at what's going on with your clients, and it's a living, breathing document to keep you fresh and alive. Howard.
Thank you. I think I always look at this and I think it's as a manager, owner, etc. I think it's you get a bit blasé about your clients, and you almost have that arrogance that you don't think a client's ever going to desert you.
Yeah.
And that I see that all the time. And then you start to lose out to your competitors. You suddenly find out you haven't got enough billers to actually hit the target you want to hit, or worse still, your big billers or your teams are not performing, or even worse than that, your teams are performing or people are performing, but they're masking the poor values, and that's creating a high turnover of staff. So again, you're never going to generate new business because they're just hanging on to those old clients and working from there. Clients not returning your call, okay? and not answering your calls. It happens constantly. But the things that you were talking about from data there, I think as soon as you see your placement ratios start to dip, then you start to look at what's happening. And you may not have noticed that because it may have only dipped by a small percentage. But when you start to track that percentage over a long period of time, that starts to be a huge problem. So we've got to start to look at the data. The other thing that about your model being outdated, if you're not winning new clients, then you've got to start to think, look, your current methodology is wrong because you're not winning new clients from that. And then if you're not measuring the trends that help you win new clients and identify that win early, then you've got a problem. So I think you've got to start to think there's lots of things that we can start to identify all the way through the process that says your current business model or your sales model or whatever it is that you're trying to push towards your clients isn't working. And what the last thing you want to be thinking about is the revenue at the end, because it's the revenue's the last thing that starts to dip. Yeah. Because if I looked at it today, the revenue might not dip for another 3 to 6 months. So I start to look at all the data that leads to that dip and work off that data then. Then I can start to do something about it earlier rather than knee-jerk reaction when I suddenly see my revenue start to dip. By that time, it's potentially too late.
Yeah, and I mean, another point here, Howard, and just a quick one, is that I remember coming out of COVID, working with a customer, obviously I won't mention, a lot of their business with the very large corporate financial institutions, and it was pretty obvious that they were going to start to become they were going to have self-sustaining models, either building up their internal recruitment teams or RPOs, looking at large corporate agencies, recruitment businesses to look after them. It was all fairly obvious it was going on, and I was waving a big red flag saying, look, this market is going to become more and more difficult for you. Nobody was listening, and today they do virtually no business in that sector at all. The fact is that sometimes it's pretty obvious, but people go into a sort of state of disbelief. It's kind of it's always, as I said earlier, it's always worked. It will carry on working, even though everything is screaming at you that your market is changing. And I think there is a reality check, and it sometimes takes external people like us to, in the nicest way, have to shake our clients and say, look, you can't be in denial. This is going on.
Well, let's challenge that then, Paul. Let's push on that into the next question, because that leads right into the next question. Leaders obviously worry about a short-term dip in revenue if they're going to have to cut clients or change their model. So how do you balance that brave decision with business survival?
I think it's, as I said a moment ago, I think it's transitioning. It becomes a big problem if you've left it so long and so late that you now have to cut and move in a different direction. It's kind of break hard, then try to move in a different direction. It's much more difficult than if you see the signs, you recognize that things are changing. And when you do that and you acknowledge that you have to make changes, then you can start to transition over a period of time. So over a period of a 6-month period, a year, even longer. You're not necessarily cutting old business immediately to focus on finding new markets. It's something you're transitioning into. And the way you would do that, I think, and the way I've done it in the past, is to take a certain model and trial it. Take 1 or 2 consultants or a small team and start to gradually infiltrate and develop a new market whilst maintaining the old one. And as you then, all being well, start to develop that new market, you can start moving away from the old one. So the idea, I think, is not to get to that point where you're desperate. You have to make a change and it becomes hard brake and you're trying to get a fast acceleration. I think if you're in front of the curve, you're aware of what's occurring, then you can move gradually, albeit relatively speedily, into a new market without having to stop doing what you've always done. You do it gradually. That, I think, is the art of doing it. It's not that short stop-start. It's actually a transition. And I think that transitioning is an ongoing process. It's not something that happens every now and then. Your whole business model should be about being agile, being aware of what's coming, and being able to move in those directions. Now, some people might argue that easier for a larger business, recruitment business, to do that, where you have more staff and more resources. But I would also argue the opposite. I think when you're small, you can be more agile than the medium or larger recruitment businesses and more able to make make those transitions. The fact is that, come back to my earlier point, you need to be aware of what your market is doing. Your point, extremely valid. Sometimes those metrics are screaming at you internally, let alone what the world is telling you externally. So the point is, you cannot be in denial. You have to be aware of these situations. And we live in a very fast changing world these days. So this is something that's an ongoing process. You're constantly analysing what's going on.
I think, though, there are a couple of things I'd add to that, Paul. First of all, some of your clients that you cut aren't actually going to impact your revenue, right? If you've got the clients who are loads of turnover but actually not making any profit, okay, you're going to lose the top line revenue, but actually it's not going to damage your business to lose that top line revenue, because it's just costing you stuff. And if it frees people up to focus on doing something different, hurrah, right? So please don't be afraid of some of those decisions if you're doing them carefully and with good data. The other thing is, I totally agree with what you're saying, Paul, but remember that change is hard. So this is my fluffy HR piece, right? People don't like changing. So if we're talking about a delivery model change rather than a sector change, it's very hard to get people to do things differently when they've always done it the same. So, or that have always done it one way. So sometimes it's easier to have a new team work a new delivery model rather than try to ask an existing team to change to a different way. So again, just think about the impact on your people of the change you're trying to bring about. Change is hard.
Yes, it's true.
Welcome back, Heather. Welcome back.
Actually, I've discovered this isn't the same Heather. If you notice, her surname is different. She's Heather Sayway. Have you noticed? This must be a distant relative that we've invited on.
That's because I was Howard Greenwood. That's fine.
Indeed,
you were away.
But I think, if we would go back to question one, you need a plan, you need a strategy, and that needs to include a tipping point with regards to revenue or get rid straight away. And that's done by the data that you look at there. And if it's done correctly, then there shouldn't be a significant dip in business, or in revenue, should I say. But I think it's time versus cost. And I think it's that, we go and look at what you were saying there, Heather, about the redeployment of some of your resources into generating new business. And that sort of leaks into what we said about question two. If your model is outdated, then you will struggle. And because you're struggling now, and if you don't understand that, then you're not close enough to your data, you're not close enough to your clients, you're not close enough to your consultants. And if you're flippant enough to think that you've got that sorted and people aren't going to change, then that's when your revenue trends start to really drop. And you've got to start to think about something different. So I think you need to, as Paul said, you need to better understand your market. I think you need to really map your market, because what you'll probably find is that you're only dealing with a small percentage of your marketplace, and there's so much market to go at. And therefore, you need to look at what your service offering is, so you can compete, A, to keep your current clients, because you can trial your new service offering there. B, you can then try that new service offering with your lapsed clients, finesse it, and then use that service offering to open new clients and build new clients. So you can't and what you're talking about, Heather, is I don't think you can let your business fall back into those old habits. And that's the art of good management, is keeping the new habits high. And we're right. Rome wasn't built in a day. Paul wasn't on that job apparently, but we never know. But Rome wasn't built in a day.
Hello.
So you've got to think that, when you adopt a new strategy, it takes time for the revenue to come in. So you need to measure everything else that before that. If you're starting to see improvements, then revenue will genuinely start to come. But we've got to start to think that you can't keep doing the same thing over and over again and getting the same results.
But by the way, I do have a Roman nose. It's Roman all over my face. You know that, don't you? Ba-bum.
Ba-bum. He's here all week, folks. So here's a question. So why do some leaders then hang on to clients who treat them like suspects, who work with multiple agencies, drive fees down, have multiple CVs, requirements, never stick to timescales, pay late, etc., etc.? What are the tough conversations that business leaders are avoiding with themselves that could unlock growth?
Okay, well, here's
Oh, go on, Heather. Jump in. No, jump in, Heather.
Yeah, I was trying really hard to get in before you, Paul.
Go on, go for it.
This is about change, right? As well. So we are as human beings reluctant to change, mainly. Not everybody, but broadly. Our instinct is to stay safe. And so it is a real challenge to challenge ourselves, to come out of our comfort zone, to admit that what we're doing isn't working anymore. And I think that's a really hard thing. So, as leaders of businesses, we want to believe that what we've always done is always going to work, because changing is really difficult. So, we can get into denial about these things, we can ignore the warning signs. And I think it's a really normal human response, right? We just kind of just go into our cave and quietly hope that everything that's going on isn't going to happen. We have to be really brave, and we have to challenge ourselves, because ultimately we're the only ones who are going to do that, right? We are the ones as leaders who are responsible for the success of our business. So there you go, Howard, a little bit more HR fluff for you. But I really think it is about a fear of change and that fear of challenging ourselves.
I think it's a good point, and it's the fluffy Heather back now. So
Mhm.
I mean, I think my position on this is maybe slightly controversial, in that I think one of the reasons that we hang on to organisations that are clearly not going to make us money, for all the reasons you gave and plenty of others, is down to a lack of business development. We are not bringing in new business, sufficiently high levels of new business to compensate for the stuff that sits there, and as you put it, that we hope we're going to make money from. Now, I mean, I think that, and this happens a lot, you guys will have seen it, we see companies that are hugely reliant on a small number of customers, a small number, and very often those clients are flaky. You know, they'll give us some business and then they don't, and so forth. I think that the reluctance to let go is also down to the fact that we're not putting time and energy into constant business development. I sometimes get told, we're not doing business development, we've got enough business at the moment, which I always think is a scary comment, because the moment you stop looking for new business is the moment, without you realizing it, that your business starts to go downhill. So I think that a lot of it is to do, you mentioned the word courage and bravery. I think it's much easier to be brave when you know that you're doing the hard graft every day with your colleagues, to be bringing in new opportunities, to be cultivating new opportunities, to develop new relationships and drive new business into your organization. When that's happening and you have a healthy pipeline, then I think it's much easier to be brave around releasing business that is simply not productive, or indeed the companies that you're working with, as Howard sort of described, are not particularly respectful of you. Much easier to cut ties with those organizations when you can look at your pipeline and think, you know what, we can live without them. We've got plenty of other business to look at. So I think it comes down to making sure that there is this disciplined attitude to business development, to cultivating new relationships, or indeed, come back to the obvious point, making sure you're leveraging the most you can out of existing clients. You know, I looked at, I won't again mention names, but I looked at a customer's last 2-3 years client reports the other day. Perms, temps or contract, hardly anything matched. Completely different set of clients that they're providing contractors, temps to the ones they provide perms to. Hardly any crossover. And it's, you know, when you look at that, you think, well, the way, I suppose the positive way of looking at it is, there is positivity there because the opportunity is there. We have clients that like us, but we're not leveraging those clients. So again, I mean, I'm not going to go into that in great detail, but if you are really on it every day, every week, in a very disciplined fashion, bringing in new business, losing clients shouldn't be a big issue for you.
So I think that comment there, Paul, sums it up, isn't it? It's very easy to manage when you're winning. It's when you're not winning is when good managers show up and teach you how to win and what to do. And I'll give you an example. You've given an example there of a client that I've been working with, and the owner, 20 plus people in the business, still billing himself a small amount, but was very worried about what would happen if we started to really address the clients. So we started to look at the clients, and that's time they were billing 49 clients. We're now down to billing 2 years later 35 clients. However, those 35 clients, 25% of those new clients are brand new clients. 2 of those clients are now in the top 2 clients billed per year. In that time, what we've done is we've looked at their placement ratio, and we removed clients that didn't have a great placement ratio, and we've doubled their placement ratio in that time. In that time, that's also doubled their gross profit. Initially, there was massive pushback by the team. This is a business that had no KPIs. They still have no KPIs. But as a management team, we're now looking at the trends. Every month, we review the trends, what's going on, review with candidates, review with clients, review the service offering. And we've trained the management line to educate the recruiters, and we've adopted a strict strategy. We put the 90-day sprints in, we review it on a very monthly basis, we reset it quarterly, and we all understand the data and what the data is telling us. What that data has created is a better financial performance. Last year, they doubled their financial performance. They went from 4.2 mil to 8.4 mil in a year where other recruiters think it's a hard year. What they did, they got rid of the time that they spent trying to service clients, as you said there, that have got high bills, high opportunity to do high billings, etc., but weren't actually delivering anything. We removed those clients and put clients in that would actually make money from, and they doubled their turnover. They doubled their gross profit, sorry. So it's absolutely about that. It's about those little marginal gains on performance from each consultant. That creates a snowball effect for the business's gross profit to massively increase quickly. But it's having the bravery to stand by that strategy and use that strategy to move forward. And I think that's the case that you're talking about there, Paul and Heather, is that lots of people fear that strategy because they fear change when actually they need a change to do the right things. Paul, you mentioned one thing there about agencies with, sort of small or reliant on big clients. So how do agents who've built models that are so dependent on one market or one single client or a couple of single clients, what would happen if that disappeared? What should they be doing about it?
It's monumentally dangerous to have your business dependent on a small number of clients. It's monumentally dangerous. And you made the point earlier, Howard, clients ultimately will leave you. It's not necessarily your fault. There can be a whole range of reasons, but you can never look at a client and say, we've got them for life. That's just ludicrous, quite frankly. So, I mean, I've said this a moment ago. I'm always frightened when I analyze a new client's business and discover that the majority of their business is set with a small number of customers. And here's a metric from back in the day when I was managing as MD of Office Angels. We said that we would put ourselves in a position where we never had more than, let me get this correct, more than 10% of our turnover coming from 10% of our customer base. Now, I always wanted our large clients to spend more money with us. More than happy for that to occur. We were pushing for that. But when it happened and a particularly large client suddenly had a bigger percentage of our overall turnover, I was pressing hard to eliminate that higher percentage by bringing in newer business so that it diminished, if you follow my logic. You cannot rely on a small number of customers because it's a disaster waiting to happen. So, I mean, we talk often about the Boston Matrix having a cash cow. Great, milk it whilst you can. Obviously, get the maximum amount of revenue from any customer that you can, but be aware of the fact that at some stage it's going to disappear, and be working flat out furiously in the background to ensure that you've got new business coming in through your pipeline. And I think anything other than that very assertive behavior is going to result, not next week, next month, or even next year, but at some point in not too distant future, it's going to result in something pretty calamitous happening to your business. So I can think of almost nothing worse. I could give you lots of examples outside of our industry of really horrible stories around organizations that were very dependent on a small number of clients. But we're running out of time, so we'll do that another day.
Honestly, nothing to add to that. I think that's bang on.
So I think we see this a lot in small recruitment agencies, and we're currently seeing it in mid-sized recruitment agencies. And quite a few of those agencies have gone to the wall already this year because their concentration is absolutely skewed in the wrong direction. And again, I've worked with a client over the last 18 months. When I first started doing that, I did exactly what you were doing, talking about there, Paul. I looked at their clients that they'd build over a certain period of time over the last 18 months, and they'd build 123 clients. However, 80% of their revenue came from their top 3 clients. So they didn't have a new business problem. What they had was a lack of understanding of missed opportunity in those other 120 clients. And so what we started to do was reallocate what people were doing during the day. So I think in the time we've gone from now, 65% of those clients that we were talking about, the 120, had only billed with once. So we did what we were talking about there, Paul. We used the Boston Matrix to identify which clients we should be looking at. We reallocated people's time within the business, and we've grown this year by 30%. The top 3 clients now are billing round about 55% of the business. We've got a drive to get that to below 40% this year and still grow by 40%. But that's by using a defined strategy of what we're trying to do and where we're going to. But it's about introducing new clients and removing those that aren't great to work with. But it was looking at the opportunity because they had a great new business attitude, but they were too busy filling the jobs of the top 3 businesses because they were swamping them and not thinking about how they could do that. So we redesigned their allocation of people in the business and what they were doing, and that made a huge difference to the development of the other clients. Now they're back into new business mode to add to that client base from there.
And Howard, just a quick point. I mean, you know, just to sort of round off this circle, it comes back to the earlier points about releasing time. And one thing that every recruitment business is short of is time. So, you know, the clients that you're not going to make money with, that Heather mentioned, you know, it's just delusional. We're not going to make money. It's quite clear. We need to release them so we can free up time, and then come back to the things we often talk about, which is look at where you should be investing your money in tech, in areas where repetitive tasks are evident, things that are time consuming, repetitive, boring, not using the skill sets of your people. If we can invest in those and again free up valuable time, then we're giving ourselves a decent shot at bringing in new business and often having the opportunity to develop new markets.
So let's move forward then, because I think that leads again nicely into this question, which is, do you think lots of agencies that have already gone to the wall, and there are lots of agencies that have already gone under in the last 6 months, were operating from a strategic growth plan? Or do you think they were stuck repeating what they were working on before the pandemic because they know no better, or worse still, they had no plan at all? And sometimes people in the business aren't challenging them because they're not allowed to challenge, and the business is run by it's my way or the highway. So do you think it's important to have a strategy and to work towards that strategy?
I think 2 things here, Howard. I think one is, as a business owner, and I mean, lots of people listening right now are small recruitment businesses, shall we say, you know, SMEs. In fact, I think everybody is. I think you need to be challenged. If you're running a business, you need to be challenged. You need to be challenged internally by people, not in an unpleasant way, but you need, if you like, dissenting voices, or at least people that will challenge you. And we would argue very strongly that you need an outside experienced voice also challenging you, pushing you, questioning you, because without that pressure, there is a tendency to keep doing what you've always done. And the question you've asked is it a lack of strategy? It's probably just old. It's old habits. It's habitual behavior. Keep doing what you've always done, hoping and praying things are going to change when it is blindingly obvious nothing's going to change. In fact, it's going to get worse. And you do need those voices around you, let alone the ones in your own head, saying you've got to change, you have to make a change. And it's important to allow that. Your point about my way, the highway, is an absolute disastrous attitude to have within your own business and with your own people. Surround yourself with people that are prepared and to question things, to be constructive with their views. Give yourself an opportunity by having an open environment. Allow people to make mistakes. Allow people to voice their views. If you have that and you're prepared to listen, ultimately it's your own decision, but you have a chance then to avoid some of these more calamitous outcomes. But just that very myopic view of your business without having anybody around you prepared to challenge you, whether that's internal or external, is dangerous.
I think there's something really interesting about that transition from being a recruiter on a desk to being the leader of a recruitment business. So many of the people that we know and that listen, that we work on, were phenomenally successful on a desk. But that skill set isn't necessarily, well, it's absolutely not the same ones that you need to be a leader of an organization. So, you know, you can be myopic on a desk and focused and just very single-minded. about what you're doing. But when you are leading a recruitment business, you need a whole new set of skills. Now, some people have got them, and other people recognize their gaps, and they build a team around them of people in their business or advisors, and they listen to those advisors, and they understand that they have limitations in their own ability. It's not a criticism, but we are none of us perfect. And it's recognizing the bits that are missing in my own skill set and building a team around you, internally or externally, that will help you. So I think the answer to your questions are no and yes, Howard.
There's an HR answer. That's what I used to get from my HRD. Am I right? Well, yes and no.
Get off the fence, Heather. It's just you started off like an absolute house on fire, and you've just gone out. You've just been blown out. I don't know what's happened there. I think it's very interesting when you talk about working with plans and working with strategies. And I think some of the clients that I've gone into where they haven't got a strategy, they're just working by what they know. And that's great, but it's what they don't know that's probably slowing them down and what's stopping growth. And that again is that vanity in the ownership of the, I don't have to change, when really if you're not changing, you're standing still. And if you're standing still, you're actually going backwards. And so we've got to start to think about how that works. And I think, some of the clients where we've pushed in jump forward plans who are now growing, they're constantly reviewing that strategy, and they're looking at expectations versus the actual outcomes. And if there's a gap, then they look at that. And I think the first thing to do is stop blaming the people and start looking at your strategy. You can't just keep shouting at people. You've got to work harder. You've got to work more. You've got to start to think about actually what's wrong. If we can't, these people can't work any harder. And so I think we've got to create a different culture, one where it's proactive participation from the consultants, where they feel free to challenge, they feel to push on the strategy, and the management understands that good ideas will come from there.
Yeah.
And that's the bit that you can do. And I'll give you an example of Bryant and May, which was a great example back in the early 1900s. Nearly went bankrupt, didn't they? And they nearly went bankrupt because they were spending so much money on product to put on their matches, the sandpaper on the side and the sulfur on the end of the match. And one of the employees had been apparently saying to one of his managers for 5 to 10 years, why do we put this sandpaper on both sides of the boxes? It's the most expensive part of the product, and we only ever use one side. And so they dropped that side, and it saved their business.
Their costs by
half. Cut their costs by half, and saved the business. But a worker had been saying that for so long, but the management structure didn't want to change. So I think you've got to look at the strategy first and address that. Then, if it is a people problem, then yes, remove the people and change the people within the business. But the first thing is you've got to look at the strategy first and make sure the strategy is right and the people can execute that strategy to hit the results that you want. So last question. So how do you rebuild a leadership mindset or a leader's mindset to truly fit for aggressive growth, especially after running a business for so many ways, for so many years, and especially at the moment when it's a hard business and people are struggling?
I think you really have to think about yourself and the support you're getting. So as leaders, we think we have to be heroes, all the time. So I would encourage people to look at their own mental health, their own physical health. Maybe I've seen some of my clients take a holiday and come back raring to go and to be refreshed. And this is, again, I apologize, I'm reverting to type. It's my fluffy HR answer. But honestly, I think we forget that, right? It's really hard. This has been 5 unprecedented years, right? Some people leading businesses are knackered, right? They're just exhausted. Look after yourself. Take a break. Get some support. Come back refreshed and ready to do all of the things that you need to do to reinvigorate your business. But it starts with looking after you.
I think that's great advice. I think there's two things. I think you're right. I think you need to step away, clear your head. And by the way, I don't think that's just, and you're right about taking your holiday. Of course you are. Get some break, get some time out. It's also taking time out every week in the business.
Yeah.
There's the old story about an executive wandering into the CEO's office, and the guy's sitting there staring into space, and the fella looks at him and he thinks he's doing nothing, he's being lazy, and the guy says, "I'm sorry, I was busy working." And I think the point here is that we all need time to think, to clear our heads, to just analyze. We talked about metrics, looking at information, looking externally. Those things are super important, and I think that's entirely true. The other thing that I think is, and we've used the word several times in the last 45 minutes, being courageous. You have choices to make, and we all have choices to make in our lives. Sometimes making those tough decisions takes a huge amount of courage, sometimes a leap of faith. You'd like to think that whatever decisions you're taking are based upon calculated gambles, not risk, not risk in the real sense, but calculated risks. You've done your homework. You're as certain as you can be that you're moving the business in the right direction, and having the courage to take that leap, to take that jump, because the alternative of doing nothing, of sitting on your hands, of waiting and hoping and praying that things are going to change is delusional, because we know that that's rarely the case, that things suddenly right themselves. So being courageous is actually not that courageous. It's the thing you have to do as a business leader. But it helps, as you said, Heather, correctly, if your head's clear, you can make those decisions based upon a calm and calculated attitude rather than one that's stricken by panic.
So I think it's simple. If you start look at the Dow Jones, the FTSE, all the big sort of top businesses, they all have coaches, mentors, mentoring them. So irrespective whether you're a 200, 300 plus recruitment agency or you're a solo business, micro business, you still need that outside view, that outside comment to help you push yourself on the way. And I think all leaders need developing, they all need growing. And I think when you think about our backgrounds, Paul, the amount of work that Adecco did on coaching and training you to be a leader, and the question was why. You've got yourself to that point, and their question was always because, or their answer was always because the leadership spine is the most influential line within the business, and everything below that follows what the leadership does. So if you actually develop really good leaders, and that including yourself, then all of a sudden you'll start to see a very different situation from the business down below, because whatever you do trickles down into the sales line. And if you can drive performance and help performance by what you're doing, by clarity, good mental health, good strategy, making sure everyone understands that strategy, you'll start to create a better level or a higher level of performance. So we've nearly finished on time.
Hey.
Hey. So that's it for our, as I say, for our series on growth. Next week, it's the podcast is out. It's the 4th podcast in the series of growth. It's with a company that has over 200 plus heads in recruitment and 30 plus managers. It's a really interesting conversation, and it was interesting because I've done that podcast, but when I looked at Martin's podcast, which was a business between 1 and 5 heads, the similarities between them were just so there. And it's going to be really interesting for any business to have a look at what the bigger players doing in the market, and how you can learn from them, and how they're doing still similar things to the small businesses, and how that runs all the way through the business. Once we finish that, we'll start a whole process, a whole new series on leadership. So that'll be really interesting. In 2 weeks' time, we'll be bringing out something on leadership to help develop your business move forward. So thanks so much for attending. Enjoy your Easter break, and we look forward to seeing you all in a fortnight's time.
Take care, everybody. Have a good break.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.